Hello and welcome to week 3, everyone. This week, we're going to provide an easier access point to the concept of critical thinking with some simpler definitions. I've also arranged for some activities to have you experience critical thinking. My goal is this gives you a good starting point from which to engage the deep and rich discussion in our text and associated readings. So let's get started. Now, what we see here is a typical textbook definition of critical thinking, and it's valid as it's exploring many different scenarios and nuances of what critical thinking is. But if you're like me, oftentimes it's overwhelming to think, well, how can I support all of this with my activities? So what we're going to do is look at perhaps a simpler way to think about critical thinking. Now, here's what I see as a helpful definition and metaphor for critical thinking. Definition as the intentional use of thinking strategies to remove confusion and reveal knowledge. And the metaphor is like a miner going into the mine, right? The miner must intend to go into the mine, and critical thinking doesn't happen accidentally, but with intention. And that person has to have tools, which are like strategies, that they will then apply to chip away the invaluable rock, which is the confusion, and reveal that knowledge, that pure gold that we're looking for. So this is a great way to think about critical thinking. Now we're going to address it in terms of what kinds of strategies, of which I propose there are really generally 2 types. The first type of strategies are what we would call strategies for divergent thinking. This is the process when you have a certain kind of problem and then you're generating many possible solutions. It's really kind of a process of induction. You might see this as an example of creative thinking in the natural or social sciences, where you start with a problem and you generate multiple hypotheses to solve that particular problem. One very popular type of divergent thinking strategy is the brainstorm. You've all been involved in this when you try and generate multiple different possibilities. Now, I'm going to have you experiment with a brainstorm in a minute, but it's important to remember the key components of effective brainstorming. And one of them is to give yourself a goal that is difficult or hard to meet. For example, you're going to have to come up with 10 different solutions in only 1 minute. And the purpose for this is that you want to make the activity so challenging that people release their inhibitions from generating creative ideas just to meet the goal. Because we oftentimes self-censor, and we don't want to do that in a brainstorm. So make a challenging goal. And then the other one is you don't want to evaluate any of your options until this time period elapses. This way, we can really experience the true divergent thinking that the brainstorm is requiring. So if you're ready, it's time to give it a try. Okay, here's your object, a paper clip. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to pause the recording and get a piece of paper out and jot down 10 ways you could use a paper clip that's not for its intended purpose of clipping papers. Okay, so on your mark, get set, pause the video, and I'll see you back in 1 minute. Okay, you're back. How did you do? Were you able to get all 10? Were you able to get some really interesting ones, like using it as a replacement for a broken zipper or an earring? I hope you were able to see the attitude of experimentation and levity that's really required to release people into divergent thinking. And whether we're doing that through brainstorms like this, or generating hypotheses, or taking multiple perspectives, the goal of all these strategies are divergent thinking, which is always a key component in critical thinking. So the second and opposite set of strategies required in critical thinking is convergent thinking. When you take all the many possibilities and you converge onto the single best answer. For example, if I asked you to look at your list of 10 uses for the paperclip and select your very best 1, 2, or 3, that would be an example of convergent thinking. And this is the second required step to really go through a critical thinking process. Now here's a good example of convergent thinking. Making a medical diagnosis. You see here a list of symptoms from numbness to confusion, trouble seeing, walking, severe headache. If a doctor is presented with a patient with these symptoms, they would try to converge on the best possible diagnosis. What do you think it might be? Well, according to medicinenet.com, best diagnosis would be a stroke. Right? So you can see the example of convergent thinking of taking disparate pieces of information and converging to one single best, most appropriate solution. So critical thinking strategies help our learners go through that divergent process of generating hypotheses and possibilities, and then a convergent thinking process of coming to the single best or most appropriate valid answer. So I'm going to provide to you a little puzzle that will help you experience divergent and convergent thinking in the same exercise. For example, number 1, storm, needle, potato. What do those 3 things have in common? Well, they all have eyes. So when you're ready, I'm going to pause the video, take a moment, and try to answer the other 3. When you're ready, come back to the video. Reveal the answers. I hope you're able to get some right, but if not, don't worry, not for a grade. What I want you to notice, though, is what you're actually going through and you're thinking when you're presented with these. You see tent, baseball, horseshoe. Your mind automatically diverges with all you know about tents, canvas, camping, baseball, players, sports, horseshoes, metal, games, and then once that constellation of divergences appear, then you converge on the thing that they all have in common. This is how your brain can quickly both diverge and converge, even almost simultaneously. So I hope this has given you a clearer understanding of critical thinking and how you might try to develop critical thinking in your learners. I wish you the very best of luck.